Welcome everybody to Unit 5 Heredity's lecture on Mendel's laws and how there are exceptions to the rules. And then we're also going to take a look at sex-linked genes and how that works. So let's go ahead and get started. Our first phenomenon that pretty much violates Mendel's law of dominance is a thing called incomplete dominance. And in incomplete dominance, what we see is a blending of the two alleles. So for example, if you had white roses and you crossed them or mated them with red roses, if there was incomplete dominance, the offspring would come out pink. And they would still be heterozygous like you would expect in a normal Punnett square. However, you don't see that Mendel's law of dominance where it says, okay, 75% of them are going to come out red and 25% white. The two allele versions, in this case red and white, they are blended together. Neither one is completely dominant, so that's why it's called incomplete dominance, and you would see a pink flower. A second condition that violates Mendel's law of dominance is something called codominance. And in codominance, this occurs when both alleles are dominant for a trait and both of them show up in the phenotype. So for example here, if you can see this flower, you can assume that, since I'm telling you it's codominance, that the parents were, one of them was red and one of them was white. And when they were mated or bred together, the offspring came out to have both colors appear in its phenotype. So neither allele is recessive, they're both dominant, and they are both being expressed by the organism. This is another example of codominance. You can see with this cow, the offspring of a brown and a white cow produced this brown and white cow. So both of those alleles were dominant and they showed up in the phenotype of this cow. A third phenomenon that violates Mendel's rules is something called polygenic traits. Now, you have learned that traits are controlled by one gene. So you have a gene, it's a section of DNA, and that codes for a trait. Well, what scientists are finding is that some of our traits that exist in our body, they're actually controlled by more than just one section of DNA. So they are composed of either two or three sections of DNA, three different genes to make up that trait. And so this is something we call polygenic traits. And a good example that scientists have figured out that are controlled by more than just one trait are things like skin color and eye color. These are both thought to be controlled by more than 4 genes on chromosomes. So because there are these different numbers of genes that control the traits, this leads to a very wide range of the trait. And so again, this violates Mendel's laws because we were told, okay, there's the dominant allele and the recessive allele, and that's one gene. But we're finding that some traits are coded for by more than one gene. The last thing that we're going to talk about that violates Mendel's rules is something called multiple alleles. Now, again, in our past lecture, you learned there's usually just 2 versions that you inherit, right? One from mom and one from dad, and they're usually a dominant kind and a recessive kind. Well, again, that's not always the case. Some genes have more than 2 alleles that could possibly be inherited. Now, you will only inherit 2, right? One from mom and one from dad. But that doesn't mean there's not more types of alleles out there that could code for different things. So for example, blood type, right? You know there are 4 blood types. There's A, B, AB, and O. Okay, and the alleles for coding for your blood can be the recessive I, so that's the lowercase I you see on the screen there. It could also be the dominant A allele, or you could inherit the dominant B allele. So if you take a look, there's actually 3 different alleles that code for blood. However, you still only inherit 2, right? You get one from the female and one from the male. Then, of course, the sperm and the egg get fertilized to combine together. But there are 3 different alleles that you could possibly inherit, 3 different types. So we call this phenomenon multiple alleles. So this leads us to gene linkage. And what it means to be linked, if you're a gene, that means 2 different genes on the same chromosome are located very close to one another. So if you take a look at the picture on the right, you can see that gene 2, 3, and 4 are what we call a linkage group, or all those genes are linked together. And the reason scientists call us them is because usually when the gametes are created and the alleles are separated into those gametes of sperm and egg, they usually do independently assort, right? That's what Mendel told us, is that they separate, they segregate, and they independently assort. Well, again, what scientists found out is that some genes are linked. And so a lot of times, if different genes are very close by on a chromosome, when they go to be put in the gametes, either egg or sperm, they'll all go together because they're so close to one another on the chromosome. So they won't independently assort and they won't segregate. So again, this kind of violates Mendel's laws of segregation and independent assortment. Before we move into sex-linked genes, we have to take a look at this picture. This picture is what we call a karyotype, and specifically this is a human karyotype. You can see there are 23 chromosomes, homologous chromosomes, and they're all lined up by their number. This is a male, and the way you can tell that this is a male is that you look at the bottom right and you look at the 23rd chromosome. And if the 23rd chromosome is an X and a Y, that means it's a male. And if it's an XX, like the same size, then that is a female. There should be 23 chromosomes, pairs, and that's what constitutes a human karyotype. Now, what do geneticists use these for? Well, they do use it to diagnose genetic disorders, because if you find like a piece of the chromosome is missing or you have an extra copy of a chromosome, that usually indicates some sort of genetic disorder. Biological sex is determined by looking at that 23rd pair of chromosomes. The other pairs, 1 through 22, they are called autosomes. So when you look at the 23rd pair, which are your sex chromosomes, females will have an homologous pair of X's. So they are designated as XX. Males, on the other hand, do not have a homologous pair, and you can see that in the pictures shown. They have an X and they have a Y. Now, this is really important because we're going to be doing Punnett squares with sex-linked traits, and it's really important to note that the Y does not really carry a lot of genetic information. So when we do our sex-linked Punnett squares, you're not going to put an allele on the Y when we do the Punnett square. And again, that is because it does not contain a lot of genetic information. If you're taking a look, really only the ends of the Y chromosome have regions that are homologous to the X. So it's much smaller, and like I was saying, doesn't really have a whole bunch. Sex-linked genes are genes that are found on the sex chromosomes. And again, mainly we're just talking about the X because that does contain more DNA. It's very easy to spot when you're doing a family tree of genetics, which are called pedigrees, because you'll notice that a lot of males can be afflicted with sex-linked genes and sex-linked disorders. And that is because males only have one X. So if they do get a disorder on their X chromosome, it will be expressed in their phenotype because they don't have another X to compete and say, nope, don't show that disorder, just hold off. So because they only have one X, whatever's on that X will be expressed because there's not an alternate version that says be normal. The most common sex-linked disorder trait that you could probably think of is male pattern baldness. And this guy right here is afflicted by it. His name is Wayne Rooney, and he is a very, very famous soccer player. So if you follow soccer, you probably know who he is. But definitely male pattern baldness is a sex-linked trait often found in males. Another sex-linked disorder is hemophilia, and hemophilia is a condition where you lack a blood clotting factor to clot your blood. So if you do receive a cut, your blood continues to be released from your body because it's not being hardened or clotted. And this did affect the royal families all across Europe because, as you probably know, they all bred with themselves and passed on this hemophilic trait. And this is what a pedigree looks like. It's a genetic family tree. And if you are fully shaded, that means you have the disorder. So you can see that a lot of males in this family, males are represented by squares, have this disorder. And again, that goes back to the phenomenon that males only have one X. So if they inherit the hemophilic gene on their X, they're going to express it. Whereas a female, if she inherits it, but then inherits a normal blood clotting factor trait, then she'll express the normal, but she will still carry the hemophilic condition and can pass it on to her sons, which is what you see here with Irene and Alice and Alex. What is also pretty cool is that scientists are finding that some traits, they are sex limited, and the expression of these traits on the sex-linked chromosomes depends on the sex of an individual. So a good example is the production of milk. As we probably know, females produce milk from their mammary glands. Males, do they have the capability of doing it? Not quite so much. So that trait is only expressed if you are a female. And lastly, what kind of throws a wrench in everything is that some traits are created or are a result from non-nuclear inheritance. So all of the Mendel's genetics and all of the exceptions, they revolve around DNA being in the nucleus and being passed on to the offspring. Well, of course, now we know that's not always the case. And as we've talked about in the past, chloroplasts and mitochondria, they do have their own DNA, and they do pass it on to the mitotic cells or whatever's being created through mitosis. And because of that, you're inheriting DNA that's not necessarily nuclear. It's not coming from the nucleus. It's coming from the mitochondria, or if you're plant, a chloroplast as well. And this can be randomly assorted when you undergo meiosis to make your gametes, which were the sex cells. Okay, everyone, that wraps up all of our Mendel's exceptions, and let's practice doing some sex-linked Punnett squares.